Hey everybody, so we're going to talk about respiratory system, have a brief overview of the respiratory system, okay? So we know that the respiratory system is going to include these different features that we see here, right? So it's going to include the nose, right, the nasal cavity, right? So all up in the upper respiratory system, right, is going to be the paranasal sinuses, right? We're going to have the nasal conchi within that nasal cavity. You're going to have the nose, right? Right behind the nose, you're going to have the nasal pharynx, okay? You're also going to have the whole pharynx, okay? Under the pharynx, you're going to have the larynx, and then you're going to have the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs, right? And you're also going to have the bronchioles as well. And those last portions, we're going to have the alveoli. All right, so again, the upper respiratory system, nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, pharynx. All right, lower respiratory system is going to be the larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, bronchioles, and alveoli. Now, some resources or some references, they'll actually classify the larynx as being the part of the upper respiratory system, but for this purpose, our reference will identify the larynx as the lower respiratory system, okay? So when we're looking at the respiratory system, right, main functions to provide an area for gas exchange between the air and the blood, right? We're able to move air to and from the exchange surfaces of the lungs, right? We're able to protect the respiratory surfaces from dehydration, temperature changes, and other environmental variations. We're able to provide protection against invading pathogens, right? Produce sound, right, involved in our verbal communication, as well as assist in the regulation of blood volume, blood pressure, and the body fluid pH. Right, so when we're looking at the respiratory system, it's going to be consisting of respiratory epithelium. That's going to be pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells. Right, you're going to find that within the respiratory tract, except for areas such as the pharynx, the smaller bronchi, and the alveoli. You're going to find in the pharynx stratified squamous cells. Okay, and you're also going to find along this respiratory tract and in the nasal cavity mucus producing cells, right, that will coat that respiratory epithelium. Okay, so when we're looking at the pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells, right, we're going to have that cilia. That cilia is going to be able to move mucus in an upward manner, right, and we call that the mucociliary escalator, right? So it's going to move that mucus upward, right, to the pharynx, so that debris, if it's inhaled, right, it can be coughed out or it can be swallowed down the esophagus, right? You can have those stratified squamous cells that's going to line the inferior portion of the larynx, and that's going to be able to provide protection against abrasion. And then you have those mucus cells, right? Those mucus cells will produce mucus so that inhaled debris will get stuck and not enter the lungs. Okay, so that's really important. And as you can see right here, we have our our ciliated columnar epithelial cell, right? And it has the cilia, right? That cilia is going to be able to move that debris, basically upward, okay? So it's going to move that debris upward, okay? Notice how we have these mucus cells, right? These mucus cells, we can see right here, I'm drawing in red, right? They're going to be able to provide mucus, right? Provide that mucus on top of the epithelium, okay? Notice how they are pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar cell. Remember, it kind of seems like it's, multiple layers, but it's actually just one layer because the nuclei are at different levels, okay? So remember that, okay? And so the respiratory has a defense mechanism, right? So we have hairs in the nose that's going to block some of the inhaled debris, right? We have in our nasal cavity, right, we're able to produce mucus to trap the inhaled debris, right? We're able to sneeze, right? That sneezing mechanism will remove any debris. And we also have in that respiratory epithelium, the mucus will trap the inhaled debris. We can cough, right? Coughing will remove the debris, right? As well as that mucociliary escalator that I mentioned. It's going to move the debris upward towards that pharynx area, so it can, again, be coughed out or swallowed, okay? So when we're looking at the upper respiratory system, right, when we're following air, right, air, of course, will enter. It can enter two ways, though, right? Typically, it'll enter through the nose, but we also know it can enter through the mouth. All right, so if it enters the nose, right, it's going to enter at that nostril area. Okay, the nostril area, or we also call this nostril the external nares, right? And it passes through this nasal vestibule area, okay? And this area is going to be supported by those cartilages, as you can see right here, okay? It's going to enter that nasal cavity, right? Right, and of course it's going to be separated by the left and right portions by that nasal septum in your nose, right? And so air will enter this right here. So if I can draw it and let's change the color to green, right? So air goes in, right, circles, kind of swirls around right here. Then it's able to go down like that, okay? And so as air flows in and around, like how I just described right here, that's that nasal conchi, right? You have the inferior, the middle, and the superior nasal conchi, okay? As air swirls around the conchi, that debris is going to get stuck in the mucus, right? And as the air swirls around the conchi, that air it warms, it humidifies, okay, that air before it enters the trachea. So now we have warm, moist air entering the trachea and not dry, cold air, okay? And then it's going to, after it basically exits the nose area, it's going to then go to the pharynx area, to the larynx, and then into the trachea, okay? You don't want air to go into the stomach, right? You want it to go into the trachea, okay? So when we're looking at the structures of the nose is going to consist of that dorsum, right? That's going to be the bridge of the nose. It's also going to have that tip, or the apex, right? You're going to have nasal bones, of course. You're going to have these external nares, right? And the external nares. You're also going to have those cartilages right there, okay? You have those paired lateral nasal cartilages, and you also have those alar cartilages as well. Okay, that's going to help to support the nose. Of course, we're going to have that nasal septum, right? That's going to be able to separate the right and the left nasal cavities. You're going to have that hard palate right here, okay? You're also going to have that soft palate right there, okay? In the pharynx area, so the pharynx is just simply a passageway that connects the nose to the mouth to the throat. And it's shared by the respiratory and the digestive system, right? So the top of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx, right? And that nasopharynx is literally the area right behind the nose, right? So the back of the nose. It's also going to contain that pharyngeal opening to the auditory tube, right? That pharyngotympanic tube, that auditory tube, it's going to be able to open up right there in that nasopharynx area. Under the nasopharynx, you have the oropharynx. Okay, that oropharynx is going to be directly behind the mouth. It's going to consist of the pharyngeal arch and the uvula. Okay, and under the oropharynx, you're going to have the laryngopharynx. Okay, the laryngopharynx is going to be that area that has the entrance to the trachea and the esophagus. Okay, and then under the laryngopharynx, you have the larynx. Okay, and the larynx is a cylinder whose cartilaginous walls are stabilized by ligaments or skeletal muscles, or even both. Right, so it's going to begin typically at the level of the vertebrae C3 to C5, and it's going to end at the level of C6 to C7, so it's not that long, right? And so when we're looking at the larynx, it's going to have these important cartilages, right? That thyroid cartilage, right? You can see this main thyroid cartilage, also called the Adam's apple. It contains that laryngeal prominence right here, all right? It's going to be made up of hyaline cartilage. Okay. However, as clearly as we can see, right, it's going to be the largest of the laryngeal cartilages. Okay, it's going to be the largest of the laryngeal cartilages, right inferior to that thyroid cartilage that's going to be connected to it by that cricothyroid ligament, that intrinsic ligament. It's going to be the cricoid cartilage, right? That's going to help to encircle the trachea. Okay, and that's also going to be made up of hyaline cartilage. We also see the epiglottis right here. The epiglottis is going to be able to close over the glottis during swallowing. Okay, so the food can actually go into your esophagus and not your trachea. Okay, and that's also going to be made up of, that's going to be made up of elastic cartilage. Okay, Now, the larynx, right? So there's different forms of cartilages of the larynx that we mentioned, right? We have those paired laryngeal cartilages. Some play a role in the opening and closing of the glottis, right? That's going to be those arytenoid cartilages, okay? So arytenoid cartilages, they're going to be made up of hyaline cartilage, right? You have that corniculate cartilage, that's going to be made up of hyaline cartilage, and then the cuneiform cartilage, that's going to be made up of elastic cartilage, though. The laryngeal ligaments, you have both intrinsic and extrinsic laryngeal ligaments. The intrinsic ligaments, right, the intrinsic laryngeal ligaments, they're going to be able to bind the laryngeal cartilages together. Right, so you can see this right here, this cricothyroid ligament, it's going to be intrinsic. Okay, it's going to be able to bind these laryngeal cartilages together. It binds the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. Now, the extrinsic laryngeal ligaments, that's going to be able to bind, for example, like the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, right, and the cricoid cartilage. So notice how we have this extrinsic thyrohyoid ligament, okay, that's connecting this thyroid cartilage to this hyoid bone, okay. The laryngeal ligaments, such as the vestibular and the vocal ligaments, right, they're going to extend between the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilages. Those vestibular ligaments, they're going to lie within the vestibular fold, okay, as you can see right here. And they're inelastic, right? They're also going to be called your false vocal cords, right? So those vestibular folds, so those, right, they're going to be those false vocal cords. They're not going to play any role in sound production. However, the vocal ligaments, right, those actual vocal ligaments, okay, they're going to be associated with the delicate vocal folds, right? And the elastic vocal folds are going to also be known as the true vocal cords, and they do play a role in sound production. Okay. Now, for sound production, right, air will pass through the glottis. That's going to vibrate the elastic vocal folds, and that's how sound is then created. However, your pitch will depend on the diameter, the length, and the tension in those vocal cords, right? So children, they have, we have a slender, shorter vocal cord, right? Thus, we have like a high-pitched voice. But for example, at puberty in males, those vocal cords, they become thicker and longer, right, producing like a deeper voice, typically than a female. And those sinuses, right, those sinus cavities, that's where we have an amplification of the sound, right? And we're able to provide or produce distinct sounds, right? That's going to depend on the movement of our lips, our tongue, and our cheeks, right, whenever we talk or make sound. Right, so this just gives you an example of, or an image of the different cartilages, right? We have the corniculate cartilage right here, right? We have the cuneiform cartilage, right? And this is the glottis right here. This is the glottis. This is going to be the opening, okay? It's going to be the opening. And notice how it's going to be, have those vocal folds right on it, right? And those vestibular folds around outside it, right? And we also have this epiglottis right here, right? Right, so it's going to be that epiglottis that's going to be able to fold over this. Okay? It's going to flap, it's going to fold over that to close it, right, whenever you are ingesting food or drink, okay? So when we're looking at those intrinsic laryngeal muscles, right, they're going to be able to regulate the tension of the vocal cords, right, and thus open and close the glottis. Whereas those extrinsic laryngeal muscles, they're going to help to position and stabilize the larynx, right? But both of them, they're going to cooperate to prevent food and liquid from entering that glottis during swallowing, though. Okay, and this gives you the process of swallowing. So number one, right, you eat, of course, goes in your mouth, right? You chew your food. Your food is going to be mixed with saliva. You're going to create this bolus, okay? It's that bolus that gets forced, right? Or that gets compacted and created by the tongue muscles, right? Your tongue is going to be able to force that bolus into your oral pharynx area, right? Your oral pharynx area, that pharynx portion right behind your mouth, okay? Then we have laryngeal movement folds, right? That laryngeal movement fold will close the glottis, right? Notice how it's up, right, at first, and then it turns down, right? And it's those pharyngeal muscles that help to push that bolus into the esophagus, right? And remember that esophagus is going to be posterior to the trachea, Okay, it's going to be right behind the trachea. And then, of course, as it moves into the trachea, as it moves into the esophagus, right? The bolus will move along the esophagus, okay? The larynx will return to its normal position, and the epiglottis moves back up to an upright position. So, under the larynx area, right, that closing, right, let's go into the trachea, right? The trachea is going to be that tough, flexible tube, right? It's called our windpipe. Right, it's about 11 centimeters long and 2.5 centimeters in diameter. It's going to bifurcate at the carina, right? So it's going to split off at the carina into like the right and left bronchi. And that's typically going to happen at position around, where your T5 vertebrae is at. Okay, this is where we're going to branch to form the left and the right primary main bronchi. It's going to contain around 15 to 20 tracheal cartilages, but they're going to be composed of hyaline cartilage. But the cartilage ring, it's actually going to be C-shaped, so it's not going to be a complete ring, right? And connecting one cartilage ring to another, they're going to be connected by these annular ligaments, okay? And so this gives you right here the trachea right here, okay? As you can see, right here is those annular ligaments that is able to bind each cartilage to another, okay? Notice how it bifurcates right here at the carina, right? That's where it splits off into the left main bronchi and the right main bronchi, okay? But again, this trachea, again, around 11 centimeters long, 2.5 centimeters in diameter, okay? And these cartilage rings, these tracheal cartilage rings, they're going to be C-shaped, okay? So they're not going to be a whole circle, right, enclosing a complete ring enclosing the whole cartilage. And why? Well, that's because you have this trachealis muscle right here, this trachealis muscle right there, okay? You want that trachealis muscle right there because that's going to be in direct contact with the esophagus, right? And remember, food goes down the esophagus, okay? So if this esophageal opening needs to expand, right, it's not going to expand on the hard structure of that cartilage. Is able to expand because there's this trachealis muscle right there, okay? So at the carina, right, the trachea is going to branch, right, creating, again, the left and the right main bronchi, okay? It's the branching, right, that forms the left and the right main bronchi. The main bronchi will then enter each lung. The right pulmonary or the right primary bronchus is going to be a little bit steeper and larger in diameter than the left, right? So you can see how it's a little bit steeper and larger in diameter, right? So typically, if you was to choke on something or swallow something, a person can aspirate foreign objects into the right lung easier than it is for them to aspirate it into the left lung because it'll fall down and it's going to fall typically in that right lung because it's steeper and as well as because it's wider too, right? So each main bronchus enters the lung at a point called the hilum, okay? The hilum is also the point of entrance and exit of the pulmonary blood vessels, right? So we can see right here the hilum, okay? And so the combination of the bronchus, the artery, and the vein, that's going to be called the root, right? So that's the root, okay, of the lung. So looking at the structures of the lung, right, you have the apex, which is going to be on that superior lobe, right? And you have the base, which is going to be on the inferior portion of the lung, okay? So the right lung has 3 lobes, right? So you have the superior lobe, okay, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe, okay? Whereas the left lung has 2 lobes, superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Notice how they both have an oblique fissure, right? However, because the right lung has an additional lobe, right, it also has a horizontal fissure as well, okay? Also notice, because the left lung only has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3 lobes, the right lung is going to be a little bit larger, and the left lung accommodates, right, for that space in the mediastinum, right, that cardiac notch, right here, that cardiac notch, that's where the heart will sit at, right? So the lung kind of accommodates for that space for the heart to sit, okay? So when we're looking at the lung surfaces, right, those structures that are in contact with the lungs, they're going to be named based off of their position, basically, right? So you have a costal surface, you have a mediastinal surface, and you have that diaphragmatic surface. Okay. We're also going to have connective tissue from the root that's going to form partitions called these trabeculae within the lungs. They're going to contain elastic fibers, smooth muscle, and lymphatic vessels. And those terminal portions are going to be called interlobar septa, which is going to be able to divide the lungs into the pulmonary lobules. All right. And so this gives you an example. And you can kind of see right here, right? This is where the heart will sit, right? And that left lung size literally accommodates for that heart in this mediastinum region. Okay. So when we're looking at the lungs, right, remember the trachea branches off, right, bifurcates into the main bronchi, right, the main primary bronchi. It's the main primary bronchi, right, that's going to then branch numerous times once it's inside the lungs. Okay, and each bronchus will divide to form, right, so each main bronchus will divide to form the secondary bronchus, right? That's also called the lobar bronchus. Okay, so we have a superior lobar and then an inferior lobar bronchus, right? This specifically looks at the left lung. Okay, but those secondary bronchi, right, which are called lobar bronchi, they're going to branch to form segmental bronchi. Okay, and these are tertiary bronchi. Okay, and each segmental bronchi, it goes into a specific area of the lung, right, called its bronchopulmonary segment. Okay, the lobar bronchi and the segmental bronchi, they're going to have hyaline cartilage plates to provide their support. Right, so notice how it's cartilage, right? But notice how we go deeper and deeper into the lungs, we have less and less cartilage. Okay, so again, that main bronchus, we can call this like primary, right? Secondary, tertiary, right? Segmental like that. Okay. So once we, now looking at the main bronchus, right? The main bronchus is going to divide into 3 lobar bronchi. Okay. We're going to have the superior, okay, specifically looking at the right lung, right? The right main bronchus. We're going to have the superior lobar bronchus. Okay, we're going to have the middle lobar bronchus. And we're going to have the inferior lobar bronchus. Whereas the left main bronchus, right, is going to divide into the superior lobar bronchus and the inferior, right? Remember, they have 2 lobes in the left lung. Okay, and so the lobar bronchi will divide to form, again, the segmental bronchi. Remember, lobar is secondary, segmental is tertiary. The segmental bronchi will then deliver air to that specific region of the lung, that bronchopulmonary segment. Okay, so the right lung is going to have 10 segmental bronchi and therefore 10 bronchopulmonary segments, whereas the left lung is going to have 9 segmental bronchi and therefore 9 bronchopulmonary segments, right? And so the bronchioles, right? So primary bronchus will branch off to the secondary bronchus. Secondary bronchus will branch off to the segmental bronchus. Segmental bronchus will then branch off into many bronchioles. Okay? And it's the bronchioles, right, that branch into the terminal bronchioles, right? Those terminal bronchioles are going to be very small. They are self-supporting, and therefore they're not going to require cartilage plates. However, they're going to contain smooth muscle. All right, so as we go deeper and deeper into the lungs, from the trachea to the terminal bronchioles, right, we're going to have less and less and less cartilage, right? And those terminal bronchioles, right, they're going to consist of smooth muscle. Why? Well, for bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction, right? To be stimulated, that smooth muscle to be stimulated in times that we need, right? For that sympathetic stimulation for bronchodilation, right, to increase the amount of air, and for bronchoconstriction when you don't really need it, right, when you're resting, for that parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, those terminal bronchioles would then branch into several respiratory bronchioles, right? It's these respiratory bronchioles within that pulmonary lobule, and these terminal bronchioles deliver air to a single pulmonary lobule. Okay, so you can see right here, these terminal bronchioles will deliver air to these lobules, right, through these respiratory bronchioles. Okay, so again, we go from, let's just write it out, right? Main bronchi, right, which is, let me write it right here, primary, and then lobar bronchi, and that's secondary, and then you have segmental bronchi, that's tertiary, right? That's going to then branch into the bronchioles, right? We're going to have the terminal bronchiole. That's going to branch into the respiratory bronchiole. And that's going to then lead to the lobule, right, which is going to consist of the alveoli. Okay? So that's how the air is going to pass through. Okay? So once we're in that lobule, right, it's going to consist of alveoli or alveolus. Okay? So the respiratory bronchiole is going to be attached to these alveolar ducts. Right? It's going to be attached to these alveolar ducts. Right? Notice how, number one, just look at how vascularized they are. These alveoli are super vascularized, right, which makes sense. Okay, so each lung is going to have about 150 alveoli, right? 150 of these, 150 million, right, of these alveoli. Okay, and they have an extensive network of capillaries, right, that's going to surround each alveolus, right? And it's because of this, right, this is where we have that gas exchange, right? The capillaries will drop off the carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen. Okay, again, those capillaries that surrounded that alveolus, they're going to drop off carbon dioxide and they're going to pick up oxygen. Okay, so each tissue or elastic tissues, right, they're going to surround each alveolus, right, and they're going to help to maintain the shape and the position of each alveolus during that inhalation and exhalation. So when we're looking at the alveolar, right, where the actual gas exchange happens, right, we're going to have two types of cells, right? The lining, which is going to consist of a single layer of squamous cells, right? These are going to be called type 1 alveolar cells, right? And they allow for the rapid diffusion of the gases, right? So these allow for rapid diffusion of gases, right, through this squamous cell. Okay, so again, oxygen will enter the blood supply, whereas carbon dioxide will leave, right? And so that's that simple squamous cell, right, which lines the alveolus. Okay, we also have those type 2 alveolar cells, right? They're going to be scattered amongst this region right here, scattered amongst those type 1 alveolar cells, right? And they're going to be able to secrete surfactant, okay? They're going to be able to secrete surfactant, okay, to reduce the surface tension, okay, to prevent these alveolar from collapsing during each exhalation. So these are very, very important, right? Those type 2 alveolar cells secreting that surfactant, okay, to prevent the alveolar collapse. We also have these alveolar macrophages, right? These alveolar macrophages, as you can see right here, right? These alveolar macrophages, they're going to be able to wander around and phagocytize any particulate matter, right? And bring that debris right back up that mucociliary tract for it to be coughed out, right? Or for it to be swallowed. Okay? So when we're looking at the alveolar ducts and alveoli, the alveolus and the blood-air barrier, right? So gas exchange will occur at that blood-air barrier, okay? Gas is going to exchange at that blood-air barrier, okay? So the alveolar cell layers, again, we have type 1 and type 2, right? They're going to be fused, we're going to have this fused basement membrane between the alveolar cells and that capillary endothelium. This is where the gas exchange occurs at, right? The body will bring carbon dioxide toward the lungs for carbon dioxide to leave the capillaries and enter the alveolar sacs, right? That's how we are able to release carbon dioxide from the body. However, when we inhale and we bring oxygen into the body, right, it's going to travel down to the alveolus, right? And that oxygen will leave the alveolar sacs and enter the capillaries. Remember, these are small elements, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, these small molecules, right, that would be able to easily, rapidly diffuse through this simple squamous cell, these type 1 alveolar cells, okay? And when we're looking at the lungs, right, we have the right and left pleural cavities, right? They are going to be separated by that mediastinum, right? And so each lung is going to be lined by a serous membrane. That membrane is going to be made up of 2 continuous layers. Those layers are called pleura. We have the visceral pleura. That's going to be portions that cover the outer surface of the lung. And you have the parietal pleura, right? That's going to be a portion covering the inside lining of the thoracic wall and the mediastinum and the superior surface of that diaphragm, right? So parietal pleura is going to be on the wall, right, the chest wall cavity, whereas the visceral pleura, right, going to be directly on the lung. And then between the parietal and the visceral pleura, we have this pleural cavity, which is a fluid-filled space. Okay, we have this pleural cavity, which is that fluid-filled space between the parietal and the visceral pleura. Okay, and so it's going to be made up of that pleural fluid. Right, that pleural fluid is going to be able to reduce friction when the lungs move upon like inhalation and exhalation. Then there is a condition called pleurisy, like pleuritis. It's going to be which those membranes produce a little bit too much pleural fluid, right? Or the membrane adheres to that thoracic wall, thereby resulting in really extreme pain upon inhalation and exhalation. Okay. When we talk about ventilation, right, pulmonary ventilation, that's simply just the physical movement of air into and out of the lungs. Okay. We also have these respiratory muscles, right? We have primary or accessory respiratory muscles. Those primary respiratory muscles are going to be the diaphragm and those external intercostals. Then we have those accessory respiratory muscles that aid in the forceful inhalation and exhalation. Right? The primary respiratory muscles, the diaphragm and the intercostals, right? The diaphragm will contract or lower to cause inhalation, where it will relax or raise to cause expiration or exhalation. Right? Those external intercostals, they're going to be able to elevate the ribs to aid in inhalation, whereas those internal intercostals, they're going to be able to depress the ribs and aid in exhalation. Right? And then, of course, we have those accessory respiratory muscles. They're going to aid in inhalation. They're going to be those serratus anterior muscles, those scalene muscles, those pectoralis minor muscles, as well as your sternocleidomastoid muscle. Right? And some muscles, right, those accessory respiratory muscles that will aid in exhalation would be those internal intercostals, the transversus thoracis, the external and internal oblique muscles, as well as that rectus abdominis muscle. Okay. So there's conditions, quiet breathing, right? That's going to be perhaps involved in the diaphragmatic breathing or costal breathing, or perhaps even both. So during pregnancy, due to the uterus pushing upward on the diaphragm, women typically use their costal breathing. However, the opposite, like forced breathing, right? That generally requires the use of those accessory breathing muscles, right? And that's going to occur typically during exercise, right? And of course, with age, right, the respiratory system will become less efficient, right? Some noteworthy changes, right? The elastic tissue begins to deteriorate. Lungs cannot inflate or deflate as much as they used to, right? The movement of your ribs are going to be restricted due to arthritis, perhaps, right? And some degree of emphysema happens after age 50, which hinders our breathing. And with age, roughly 1 square foot of respiratory membrane is lost each year after age of 30, right? So this just gives you guys a brief introduction of the respiratory system, okay? Thank you guys for listening, okay?